what have we been told by the doctors and all by the medical advice? Wash your hands 20 seconds or use a sanitizer, a very strong alcohol, isopropyl alcohol, for about 5 to 6 seconds, the alcohol strength being somewhere in between 70 to 90%. Why so? Okay, allow me just to go back to that picture that I showed you a few seconds ago here. So what I'm trying to show you or lead you back onto is the picture that we initially saw in this connection here. So that's the part. Let's have a look at that. Here is my tennis ball, which is the lipid membrane, within which cages the RNA, the ribonucleic acid inside. And the outer coatings are all these spiky things that manage to work like a needle and poke the RNA inside our body. That's the job of these spike proteins. Now, what the, and I have told you that it is basically 5.5 to 8.5 pH in strength. Now, what your strong soap really does for you is it basically breaks this lipid layer. It literally breaks the lipid layer, opens up the RNA, and damages it. If the RNA is damaged, it is deactivated. So that's how it actually works. And the time frames are literally indicative of the strength of the alkaline or the isopropyl alcohol strength that will do this damage. So yes, it definitely works. And yes, it is a very good form of a stopgap defense. It will not last you forever, but it will work for a certain length of time, and you will need to repeat that time and again. Asymptomatic carriers. And this is another branch of our mathematical analysis. What is the importance and impact of the asymptomatic carriers? Is it really true that carriers, typical example would be people with high immunity in themselves who are carrying the disease. They are not themselves infected by it, but they're just like a non-infected carrier of the disease and thereby transmitting it everywhere. You can't protect yourself from that, literally, if that's true. But what is the probabilistic number of people being asymptomatic carriers? That is something that we can ask. And this is something that we are actually trying and probing, not just us, certain other groups as well. The answer is a question at the moment. I haven't got an answer for that. Is infection a key subject? Absolutely not. Now, this is what I wanted to say at the start by using the word mortality ratio. Mortality ratio, recall, is the ratio of the number of dead to the number of infected. So how many people are dying from the number of total infected people? So basically, that is the important thing, not the absolute value of the number of people getting infected. If at all, it is very good for you, as I will come to later, in the form of the herd immunity development. The vitamin C protection, I have described this and that we have talked about that. The virus dies in tropical warmth, complete rubbish. It does not. India is a classic example. High altitude countries are safe. Absolutely not. Sweden, take that example. And the therapeutics, we have touched a little bit on that. We can go into the details, but basically, hydroxychloroquine, remdesivir, the range of corticosteroids, there have been two very vaunted groups from the vaccine group, the Oxford group, Sarah Gilbert, and the drug repurposing group. So this, I think it's called Anti-Bibu. They are from Cambridge University. So these two groups have come up with a whole range of options for, and they've zoomed down. They've studied 60,000 possible drug candidates, and they have zoomed down on 6 possible candidates, some probable and some improbable, probably. Hydroxychloroquine and remdesivir rank very high in the list of the 6. That's where we should stop, because I can't say anything much more than that. Now I come to that oxymoron that we started out with. What is the model? And why should somebody, anybody, bother with a mathematician or a physicist making certain studies related to biology? Well, let's see what are the key questions here. The first one, I think I have answered this, or at least tried to. Shall we primarily bother about the rate of infection or about the mortality to the infection rate? So shall we really bother about how many people are getting infected, or really how many people are dying out of this infection? The answer is the latter. Are healthy people equally prone to a COVID attack as the comorbids? That's a more medical term. Comorbids means people with predisposed health issues. So for example, a person is already suffering from heart ailment, kidney, lung disease, etc., etc. and the origin could be completely non-COVID related. So these sort of people are called the comorbids. So are the healthy people having the same sort of an infection probability as those people? As we now know, no, the answer is not. The comorbids are predominantly comorbids, and the elderly are predominantly predisposed to this disease. So the infection rates are very different. Have we got the infection rates? No. Do we have an idea about the range, the window of the infection rates? Yes, we do, and I will show you later. Can I predict the number of dead and infected by statistically analyzing past data? Well, I have written, well, what data? I'm not talking about the country data, and I'm not talking about the legitimacy of the data obtained. So there are countries, certain countries that have been accused of suppressing data, etc., etc. This is not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about, shall we study the number of infected, the number of dead, the number of recovered, the number of susceptibles, the number of healthy susceptibles, etc., etc. What do I mean by data? The answer is all of them. That's the safe answer, and that's the only answer. Is lockdown of any use? And I will show you comparative statistics of putting on hypothetical different lockdown dates and how the numbers would have changed. I will come back to that when we go into the details in part 2. Shall we rethink the conclusions based on the definition of a conventional reproduction number? What is a reproduction number? Well, literally it means how many new infected persons are being generated from one single infected. So that's rather the average number of that over the entire time span. That's called a reproduction number. So how many new infected people are being reproduced from the first infected person? Are densely populated countries more suspect? Now, this is a wonderfully optimized balance, as we will try to rethink and clarify again. So you see, we have a list of 6 questions. All of them, in varying ranges, are quantitative answers. This is where statistical or mathematical modeling comes in the fray. This is an area where a simple biological answer or medical answer is not sufficient, it's not enough, and it's often very incompatible. So we need to have this happy marriage between biology, medical science, with statistical modeling to take our next step. Now here I have got a cartoon diagram explaining to you what I mean by herd immunity. So look at the person smiling at the center. So this guy is sort of circumnavigated by many layers of people, each of which are protected. Okay, so I'm just reading out, and I have taken the liberty of writing reminding ourselves of a very famous description from one of Indian epics, Mahabharata, the Chakrabuhu. Suppose an unprotected agent, the smiling person, sitting at the center of a series of M concentric circles, each protected by R equally spaced armed soldiers. These armed soldiers are the guys who have been previously infected and have now recovered. What is the probability that an invading army comprising N soldiers, so N number of COVID-19, will be able to penetrate all these M layers of protection to get this central agent? The answer is, and this is a very simple standard probability problem that we sort of study in our higher secondary in our A levels. The the filtered number starting from N reaching the center person would be very low, insignificantly low really. So this is essentially the sense or essence of herd immunity. So herd immunity means if a person without a protection is being surrounded by people with protection, the person sitting at the center is protected. That's the entire essence. Question is, how will that circumnavigation happen, especially in connection with COVID-19 that is known not to have a vaccine, not even a proper therapeutic dosage. So we do not have a drug, medicine, we do not have a vaccine. So where is this extra ring of protection supposed to be coming from? So this is something that will be the start point of our initial model. So the population biology model, S will stand for susceptible, that means people who can be infected. I for the people who are already infected, and R the people who are recovered. Okay, so let's try and quickly make sense of this mathematical outlier. I promise to the non-mathematicians and to the non-physicists that this will not need any serious mathematical involvement. This is basically common sense logic. A mixed population, you have some people who are prone to the infection, Maybe because of age, maybe because of their personal immunity levels, etc. Some people who are already infected, and some people who have actually recovered from the infection. Now, what we are saying here is, as infection increases, the number of susceptible will decrease. I think this is common sense. In a population, if the one thing goes up, the other has to go down because the population number is conserved. So each infected agent creates beta, which is the fraction of the number of people getting infected, times S new infected agents. Okay. So each infected agent is creating that many infected agents out of the initially susceptible group. AI equal to number of agents recovering every day. Okay. Now, infected every day would mean numbers converted from the susceptible, that means now moving from susceptible to infected, minus the numbers recovered. So the number of people who have been infected minus the number of recovered is basically the number lost from the susceptible regime to the number gained in the recovered regime is equal to the number in the infected regime. So if you just put these two in connection, you get the basic mathematical model. This is called the susceptible, infected, recovered model, SIR model. So the first equation is telling you how fast the number of the susceptible are changing. So the number of susceptible will change when a susceptible interacts with the red guy. The red guy is the infected guy. So a susceptible interacts with the red guy at the rate of beta, the number of susceptible will decrease. So the rate of decrease of the number of susceptible literally means the same rate added to the infected, but a certain fraction of the infected are also recovering. So that's AI, and that is then DRDT, number of recovered, is equal to AI. Okay. So I'm hoping that we are actually happy with this. So in very simple terms, the rate of change of infected, that means the daily rate of infection, is effectively equal to the negative of the number of the rate change of susceptibles and the negative of the recovered rate. Okay, so if you have a look at that, then you can easily solve this particular model. I will show how the solution looks like in the form of a plot. But basically, the assumption here is I'm neglecting the birth and immigration control. I'm completely neglecting the possibility of new people being born or new people dying of other causes. I'm assuming a homogeneously mixed population, so I'm not assuming the fact that certain parts of a town, you might have densely populated people with a higher risk of infection as opposed to the other part where people are sparsely populated and hence with a low risk of infection. These are being neglected here. All recovered are immune forever. That's a very strong assumption as well. We are assuming that somebody who recovers is never getting hit by that same disease again. But in spite of its minimalist description, and I have already described this, the total population is conserved, we get a very nice qualitative understanding of how infection kinetics actually works. The blue line that you see is the line for the susceptible. So as you can see, the x-axis is the timeline, the y-axis are the different infection levels. So as time increases, the blue decreases. That means the number of susceptible decrease. When the number of susceptible decrease, where are they going to? Well, they're actually contributing to the number of increase in the infected. That's the red line. And the competition in between the two is what is ensuring that some people do get recovered and the population is sustained. So that is your green line. So the green line is basically a push-pull mechanism between the blue and the red line, and this is the optimal line standing in between. Okay, so this is a very conventional form of an infection kinetic model. And now we go on to the model where we are talking about immunity development. So here we are assuming that there is a mechanism of developing the immunity. So we are assuming there may be a vaccine, there may be certain people who, because of their antibody development, have developed their innate immunity. So let's just look at the cartoon diagram on the other side. So we have everything identical to the previous model. The only difference is we now have got a bunch of vaccinated people who are putting that ring of protection around ourselves. So that is a very strong mechanism that we have here, that the equation balance remains much the same, barring the additional inputs from V. Let's look at how it actually works. I'm starting with the susceptible. See, So small v1, I will rather show you the descriptions because that will make things a lot clearer. This v1 that you see, the arrow entering the susceptible box, v1 refers to the fraction of vaccinated susceptible. So 1 minus v1 is a fraction of non-vaccinated susceptible, and capital B is the birth rate. So the birth rate of people who are not vaccinated. So that's your first contribution. That's a steady contribution coming in the picture in the DSDT model. So this number then sort of infights between some people who are getting infected. That is exactly the previous term, S times I, beta being the infection rate. So number of some people are leaving the susceptible box, going into the infected box, and that number is beta times Si. Some people are entering the susceptible box from the recovered box, so that number is Q1 R. And some people are also entering the susceptible box from the vaccinated box. That rate is Q2 times R. So you conjoin all of them and you simply get your first equation. Now, if I look at the infected box, what is it that I'm saying? Well, infected box has a population gain from the susceptible box. That's beta times Si. Okay. And it has some people who basically recover from the infected box. So that number is small a. So A times I are the number of people who are actually recovering, going back to the recovered box. And P times I is basically the death rate due to other disease than the particular epidemic we are talking about here. So this way, you can develop the entire...
Amit, Mukesh, some Mukesh Chandra is presenting. I request Mukesh Chandra, please don't present.
Oh.
Please proceed.
Okay. Okay, I didn't actually notice it because thank you, Kishore, because I'm on the full screen, so I can't even see the Google Meet description at the moment. So I'm very happy to take questions, whatever you have later, but let's just carry on with the summary because of the constraint that we really have. It would have been much nicer to do this in a real public where we could take live questions. Unfortunately, we have to postpone those questions until the end. So dNdt then is slightly different. The rate of change of population density is now not a conserved number, but if you look at the solution, at large time, the number density again is a conserved quantity. So this is what ensures sanity in the system. So what do we get out of this particular description? Let's see. We get out a few certain interesting description. I will not go into the mathematical details. I just wanted to draw your attention to two things. The first one is called the disease-free equilibrium. This is the result of some mathematical analysis, basically simple linear stability analysis followed by some perturbation. And the other one that I call stationary state 2 is the one which we call the endemic state. So each of them have multiple options. There are real eigenvalues. I'm not going into the mathematical details because these are sort of regulation descriptions. But what I'm trying to repeatedly draw the attention to is from that particular model, SIRV model, I do get a description where we have something like an endemic state arriving out of an initially diseased state. Now, on top of this, I am trying to add something that I think in India we are very familiar with.
Sorry, Amit.
Yes?
Amit, sorry. We can't see your presentation. We can't see your presentation.
Oh, really? Let me go back.
Yes, we can't see.
No, we can see the presentation. You only have to pin the other window. He has two windows. Pin the other window. Look in the participants list and pin the other window. We can see the presentation.
Is it fine now?
It was always fine. It was always fine. They had just have to pin the other window.
Yeah, they have to pin the other window.
Yeah.
I have to admit that I'm not particularly.
Yes.
Okay. I'm not particularly.
It's okay.
Familiar with.
It's okay. It's okay.
No,
Google
the
Meet,
presentation did
because-
not stop at any moment. It just because the other person started presenting, it just went off. You were always there.
Right. Okay. No, this is the problem with. I mean, the YouTube link would have been infinitely better. It's my fault that they managed.
Hello. You go to the mathematical model.
Yes.
You go to the mathematical model.
I'm going to the mathematical model because I have to come out of the end. Give me a second. Okay, so now we were in the SIRV model, and now what I was just starting out with is some particular feature that we have seen predominantly happening in India. Actually, it has happened everywhere, but more so in the Indian context. So we have a very practical situation evolving due to the number of migrant people from many different reasons. They could be laborers, they could be, coming from different professions, but basically people from infected regions, just because of livelihood or for any other reason, moving on to the so-called uninfected or at least lesser infected regions. So basically migration. So migration in the form of a diffusion is what we have added onto that particular mix. So these last terms in each of these equations, the terms starting with capital D with the suffix either S, I, R, or V, and then multiplied with the grad square of S, I, R, or V is what we see here. So these terms are supposed to be replicating the impact of the migrant people, and the migrant people, do they really disturb the economic, epidemic equilibrium? Look at the top picture, the one called A. I will come back to the bottom picture later. Sorry. Yeah. So the top picture, the ones that you see, the A, that actually shows you how the infection is actually spreading. It's like a heat map. So the x-axis is time, and the y-axis is basically the number density of spread. So X stands for infection propagation density. So it's clearly showing that the infection is sort of radiating out very fast from the point from its epicenter. And then what you see in B and C is how the different dynamics, the colors are indicative of the dynamics. So S stands, the blue is S, the yellowish one is recovered, the red is infected, and the greenish one is the vaccination. So when vaccination increases, basically the whole thing gets contained, and otherwise all of them sort of eventually hit an equilibrium. So initially the number of S gets decreased, and then it saturates, then basically the same thing happens with the number of recovered. When infection rises, recovered decreases, but then both of them saturate. And the impact of all of that is what you see here. Now, what we could do is, just to digress a little bit into technicality, there's something called the Fischer-Kolmogorov model of infection kinetics, which could actually be used to solve the this particular model that I've written analytically in the asymptotic regime. And with that, what you can calculate is the actual velocity of infection propagation. So the new plots that I'm showing you here, the y-axis of both panels are the velocity of infection propagation. And in the first one, plot A, in the bottom panel, V is changing with the density of the infected migrant. So basically, when the number of infected migrant increases, how is the velocity of infection changing? And the next one is how the same thing, how is the infection changing as the conversion rate of infection increases. Now, please note, when you have more infected people migrating from location A to location B, obviously the total number of infected people in location B has already increased. This is what you see in panel B of the bottom stuff. So beta increases when DI increases, and along with it, V increases, and as you can see, the statistics clearly says that migration does increase the rate of infection. And in fact, what we can do here is we can go beyond that. We can actually calculate and put precise numbers. If you give me the number of migrants from a certain area to a certain area, together with the individual statistics before and after, I, using this sort of a modeling, could actually tell you what is the additional level of infection just because of this migration, and not only that, what would be happening in the future. So it's not just what has happened now, how much of that would be impacting the future is what we can say. Now, what is the take-home message from this? So the speed of an epidemic spread, or the pandemic spread, if you like, is given by that particular formula. And not bothering with the formula and focusing on the outcomes of the formula, speed of infection increases with increasing diffusion. That means when more and more infected migrants move from one area to the other one, infection increases, as I've just mentioned. Speed of infection also increases if which is common sense, the infection rate increases. This can be due to the additional number from the migration. This can be just because the locality where they're migrating to has suddenly erupted in their infection regime. That can also happen. Speed of infection will increase with increasing saturation level of infection. Now, please have a look at that. If beta C, where beta C is what I have described, if beta C increases, and how can beta C increase? Beta C will increase when SI, the number of the infected susceptibles, will actually increase, then beta C decreases. If beta C decreases, V increases. So again, we see the connecting loop. It's like a feedback architecture where if one of the components is changed, there's a push-pull mechanism operating in the entire structure that changes or destabilizes the entire dynamics in operation. So basically, the take-home stuff from here is increase in the conversion rate from vaccinated to susceptible leads to decreasing V, and this is what we were talking about in connection with the herd immunity. So basically, you could potentially have a ring of protection if you manage to control your beta C. If you manage to increase the value of your beta C, your V decreases. That means your effective infection propagation decreases. So this is, mathematically speaking, how it can be defined, and logistically, just from common sense understanding, it makes a lot of sense that beta C increasing means the number of susceptible decreasing, number of susceptible decreasing, and simultaneously the number of A and P increasing. Just again to remind you what these A and P were. So A and P were the quantities that I have got here. So if you look at that, A was the recovery rate from infection and P was the death rate. So when recovery rate increases, and you can put P equal to 0, P is alluding to the death due to non-COVID infection or non-epidemic infection. So if I put P equal to 0, the recovery rate from infection, if it increases, together with the susceptible being increasing, then we have a good case in hand. So that's literally like what I started out with, the cartoon diagram defining herd immunity. So basically that would mean you have a ring of protection around yourself, although you yourself are not infected. And how is that actually happening? Because the people around you have developed certain antibody, either through treatment, which in the case of COVID-19 doesn't work, or otherwise through antibody development, which practically is the only form of immunity that we can hope to at the moment. So this is now, so there were certain people who actually worked with me in that, and I've just given you some details for the more research-minded audience. So these are some publications. If you want, you can certainly have a look at that later. So I've worked on this with some PhD students and a collaborator. So now we go on to, we will take the juice from what we have just learned, and I will straight on show you the mathematical model, and then I will go on to the prediction, which would be more interesting. I'll not bore you with a lot of mathematical details here. Stark facts. In terms of sheer numbers, COVID-19 has far outweighed SARS-2, Ebola, Zika, with only HIV ahead in terms of the mortality ratio. And that then becomes the worst declared pandemic in 100 years, because the HIV is an ongoing issue, and probably COVID-19 would be as well. What are the characteristics? Very high rate of infection, airborne or non-airborne. Non-airborne would typically mean surface propagated. Extremely high mortality to infection. So that means an extremely high mortality rate for the comorbids, the people with pre-existing conditions. Very high recovery rate of the healthy. So the people without the predisposed medical conditions, they're more than likely to recover. So this is a very good news. What I'm trying to do here is outline all the characteristics, and then I will pit them against the models that we have discussed, and I will show you most of them are not actually tracked in those previous models, which is why we need the new one. Substantial relapse probability. That is a very bad news, but that is unfortunately the true news. That the recovery is not a guarantee for an antibody. If you can still remember the first model that I showed you, the SIR, I was assumed that anybody who has recovered from being infected is never getting infected anymore. Absolutely not true for the case of COVID-19. The lung alveoli deactivation, multi-organ failure due to depleted oxygen supply. I have discussed this. Very high number of elusive spike proteins, that hide and seek game that I was talking about. So there are loads of spike proteins and they're extremely difficult to track, practically impossible. In short terms, in very simple terms, it means the probability of us having a potent vaccine in the immediate future is very low. Personally, I don't even think that will be happening over the next few years. No vaccine, no therapeutic, that's the stark reality at the moment. Okay? So way out, what is it? Vaccine, drug, or is it herd immunity? My protagonist in this particular game is the last one, especially since the first two seem not to be making much headways at the moment. So now, why can't we see this, use the models that we have just discussed? Well, let's look at what these previous models do not have. The models, I have shown you three models, an SIR model, an SIR-V model, and an SIR-V model with the migration possibility through diffusion. None of these account for the fact that for COVID-19, there's a substantial differential mortality rate between the healthy and the non-healthy. By healthy and non-healthy, I mean people were healthy before the COVID attack and unhealthy before the COVID attack. The model, none of these account for the fact that an infected healthy susceptible is more likely to survive than an infected comorbid susceptible. Just discuss this. The understanding for a non-pandemic is that overall population density is generally conserved. With COVID, absolutely not. So again, to put it in very simple terms, I come from a small town close to Calcutta, it's called Chandanagar. Now, that town has a bit of an antecedent. It used to be one of the three French colonies many years ago, and it still has a very strong French connection. In fact, it was like the refuge of the hideouts of the Indian revolutionaries many years ago. The fact is, if I'm even looking at a small town like Chandanagar, and if I just look at the number of people in 2 or 3 different time slots, successive time slots, the number of people who, the total population, there's a substantial reduction in number just because of death. And you could see the news media of late, even today morning, in fact, more people are dying. So basically, it says that the population density is not conserved. And that is something that has to be accounted for in a self-consistent structure. So standard SIR, SEIR, that E stands for exposed. I have not considered this explicitly in any of the models that I showed you. Some people have done, there are lots of studies, but none of them actually account for these 3 factors. And what they're doing is, and I would, with a bit of honest statement, you may like or you may dislike this particular statement, but basically a good bunch of these so-called predictive papers, or the so-called COVID-19 modeling papers, have largely been statistical data extrapolation, nothing else. What am I talking about here? I'm talking about the following. So if you give some data, so X column and Y column data to a 10-year-old, and ask him or her to open Microsoft Excel, right-click, fit the trend line, a 10-year-old can do that. This is not modeling. Why is it not modeling? Because using a certain fit function, that means simply using a high-level polynomial, I can fit any behavior, any functionality in the world. But this will not have the predictive probability. So that means my past data fitted in this perfect manner will not be able to tell me anything about what might be happening in the future. That's not good. This is not the sort of modeling that we are trying to do. And unfortunately, this is by and large what has happened. And a good bulk of the governmental decisions, and please note, I'm not talking about India only, a good bulk of the governmental decisions have been based on such fictitious extrapolated modeling. And hence, we have had to suffer a lot. And by suffer, I mean dying. A cardinal mistake committed by many popular studies. I won't take names. Many of you will be familiar with the names, but most importantly, if you just bother to dig a little bit into Google Scholar, you will find sort of a cartload of such publications making fantastic claims. All you need to do is pick their number, what they have projected, if they have bothered to, for the future, and put it against the real number. You will see that completely discordant. The numbers do not agree. And this is what I'm talking about. I want to make these numbers agree. And how should I do that? Well, the start point would be this. So I will try to fix everything that I said were not there, and the fix will come in the form of this cartoon diagram. Look at H and P. Them together form the initial susceptible S group. What I mean is I have now subdivided my susceptible group that I previously called S into two subfractions. H, which represent the healthy population, that means number-wise the bulk population, who have much lower probability of catching the infection, also much faster probability of recovering, as opposed to the other group, the P group, which might be the comorbid, the elderly patients, etc. Number-wise, they're smaller than H, but they're more liable to an infection, and them surviving an infection is much, much lower. So they're more open to mortality statistics. So I have kept them separately. V is that ring of antibody, the herd immunity that is trying to protect that. We do not have that yet. I'm hoping that it would come out of the model. So I keep that as sort of a nascent term that I hope will emerge, and it will not basically evolve into zero as I look at the dynamics, which is what we will do. R still stands for the recovered. I stands for the number of infected. And D, what did I say? One of the other important traits was just because of the numbers of people dying, the population is not conserved. So we need an independent differential statistics for the number of people who are actually dying. So D stands for the mortality rate or the mortality description. Now I go into the individual categories and you will see the description is superbly simple. Start by looking at the H box and you can make your own conclusion out of that. So if I look at my H box, the H box, we have some contributions from the V box. It has contributions from the R box. It has also negative contribution from the I box. Okay, so the number of healthy people getting infected is H times I multiplied with the beta 1. That is the rate of infection of the healthy population. Q suffix 1H is the number of people who are returning back to the healthy box after recovery. Q2HV is basically the additional number of people who are coming out of the immunity box, the vaccinated box. And the number of people basically leaving the fray is H2V into H, and then gamma H, we can put gamma to 0 if we are not bothering with deaths other than COVID-19. Gamma stands for the death rate for all other deaths which are unrelated to COVID-19. But we need to bear that in mind as well, because we have tremendous situations where lots of deaths are being alluded to or attributed to COVID when they're in reality not. Okay, so I do this for all the different parts of the model. So I have a dynamics for the healthy decrease rate. I have a dynamics for the predisposed decrease rate. By decrease, I mean infected and eventually succumbing to the infection at times. Infected rate, and then I have got the entire statistics laid in front of me, which looks the following. Where gamma, as I have already said, is the natural death rate. The delta, which I ascribe to the P group, the predisposed population group, please note, I have been repeatedly saying that the predisposed population group has a much higher rate of infection than the H group. That higher rate is the quantity delta. And then everything else remains unchanged. W and zeta respectively indicate the death and recovery due to COVID. Okay, so now I have got a minimalist structure, and if you look carefully and if you number count, you will find that this model, including the initial conditions, they have 17 parameters. Now that is a very, very long number, and you can immediately accuse me by saying you've got a 6-dimensional model, 17 parameters, and you can practically fit anything. No, I can practically fit anything even without having all those parameters in my 6-dimensional model. But I do not want to fit, I want to predict. And how do I actually predict is what we will now go on to. I have, or rather we have, subdivided the entire group of 19 countries. As I mentioned before, I took the data from the Johns Hopkins repository, and the color coding is very carefully structured. Class A refers to those countries, and I will come back to the details. Class A refers to those countries which have ongoing heavy to moderately heavy infection regime. Class B are the ones which are almost recovered. some almost cross the recovery regime. Class C are the ones which were initially infected and definitely recovered now. So that's green. And class D are the one with raging infection regime. Now, some of them could be interlocuted. So the first and the last group, the purple and the red groups, some of the members could be sort of transmuted in between. For example, I could shortchange New York State from class A to class D, and I could move, for example, France and Portugal to class A. This is quite subjective opinion-wise, but you get the point. I'm talking about two regimes where the infection is very much ongoing. There's the purple and red, and two regimes where the infection are either dead or otherwise sort of semi-dead, or at least way past their peak. So this is what I mean, and I've chosen a range of different countries to highlight and basically to test the remit and the strength of this particular model. So this model I will be talking about is not just India specific, actually not even. India is one of the many possible countries that I've taken as an example of. It is a very good example to take given the ongoing range that we have, and it is like an acid test of the quality of prediction that we can make. Acid test that is already qualified with all the others, as I will show you shortly. Now, I will show you results, but before that, what is it that we have done? So let me just bounce 2 steps back into the model that I showed you only a little while ago. So this model, what I call the complete or the most updated COVID-19 infection kinetic model. So this model has a unique feature. So this model, what it is actually doing here is, as you could see, this model literally has, I mentioned, 17 parameters, including the initial conditions, and I'm fixing those parameters. Fixing how? I have not deliberately gone into the details of the AI mechanism. The one that we have used here is called Bayesian MCMC. So MCMC stands for Markov Chain Monte Carlo. I will break those words down into very simple to understand descriptions. Let's start with Markov. A Markov description means if I know the event or the numbers of people, let's say, dying at yesterday, I will be able to tell how many people will die today, or at least the number of people dying yesterday serves as the input for my prediction for today. Okay, so it's basically only one time unit apart. That's what a Markov description means. The Monte Carlo will come to at the very end. Bayesian means basically we have a conditional probability description. I think you will agree with me based on the discussions of the past 3 models, especially when I was talking about the infection propagation rate, we found that they're all interconnected. I use the word feedback to define them. So basically, if one increases, the other decreases. It's like a push-pull optimization mechanism. So that, in this particular case, would mean that if you want to tell me something about, let's say, P, the number of predisposed and how they're changing, you need to have information about H, I, R, V, and D. Okay, so that means I cannot say anything about P without having finite statistics about the other 5. And in turn, all the other ones. To know I need to have H, P, R, V, and D. So these are conditional probability statistics. The more mathematically formalized version of that is Bayesian statistics. So that's Bayesian, that's Markov. And when I say Monte Carlo, essentially what's going on here is at every time point, the system is basically made to saturate using the total statistics. Total statistics here means we are taking the total number of infected, and we are also taking the total number of people dying. So this is the data that we are using. So the total statistics. So for every time points, it's being made to saturate. And at that saturation point, we are calculating the value of the parameters, all 17 parameters. These 17 parameters then serve as the input for the next time step, and for all subsequent time steps, they're continuously upgraded. Please note, when I start from the first time point and go up to the very end time point, and by doing this sort of auto-upgradation using my Bayesian MCMC upgradation mechanism, when I reach the last point, almost inevitably in my first set of correction, the last parameter numbers that I see there are not good enough to make predictions for the data that I do not have. That means going into the future. So I need to do that many, many times, and I have to set that to a certain level of optimized convergence. The way we are doing it at the moment is we are actually involving 3 supercomputers in Leeds, which are doing this quite long runs for every time, for every set of new statistics, just to get an idea. In these supercomputers, which are quite powerful supercomputers, for every country statistics, we need something in between 8 to 12 hours runs just to get each plot that I will show you now. So now I come to the results. So first of all, this is a qualitative result, not predictive yet, a qualitative result just to compare with what I showed to you in the past. So you will see H from the past was quite similar to either the black or the blue. Black stands for the healthy population and the blue stands for the predisposed pre-existing conditions. Initial decrease, then a flattened saturation. You have I that is initially increasing and then gets controlled. You have recovered that basically steadily increases and then finally saturates. And this happens because you have a certain vaccinated population where vaccination is initially very strong and then it sort of saturates out, meaning most of the people fall within the ring of protection. So if you look at the dynamics, the push-pull mechanism is still very much there. You have HP fighting against I to generate a steady R and V, and when R and V become stabilized, your D is stabilized. So death initially increases, that's a strong line that is growing up, and then it stabilizes. So this is the qualitative description based on data training, as you can see, from 10th of February to the 29th of June. So these are all data trends from this huge time length, and I will go into the prediction when I show you the results. Let's first start here. The 0 for all the plots, every subsequent plots that I show you on the time axis, that means the x-axis, is 22nd of January. Okay, so if you start counting from the 22nd of January, and if you look at the 2 regimes that each of these plots, so let me clarify first what the color coding in each of these plots mean, because they will remain uniform all throughout. The blue region is basically the region where we have data trained. Okay, so in this left panel, UK, between approximately 50 to about, I should say, like 160-ish, you have the blue regime. The blue regime is where the data training was done. So in some sense, you can call it probabilistic fitting. And then we stopped the parameter values at that particular time point, let's say 160-ish, and used those parameter values for all subsequent predictions going forward. So between 160 to maybe it's 180 or something, you have the yellow patch. The yellow patch is the predictive patch, as you can see. So the training is blue, the prediction is yellow, and as you could see, they match almost bang on with real data. This is the UK statistics, and I will come to all the different statistics one by one. So the outsets of these plots are showing the cumulative numbers. So cumulative numbers means on the left I have infection, and on the right panel I consistently will have the death statistics, the mortality statistics. So for either, in cumulative would simply mean the number yesterday plus the number today plus the number the day after tomorrow, etc., etc. All these. And the insets, they are the daily pictures. So the inset of the left panel is indicative of the daily infected in UK. As you can see, UK is way past its peak point, and it's literally in the remission mode at the moment. It applies both for infection as also for mortality. Now, I must add a very important point here, as we will see being reflected later. In our evaluation, we put a lot more emphasis. That means, mathematically speaking, we put a much higher weight factor in the Bayesian MCMC kernel on the mortality statistics compared to the infection statistics. And why is that? This actually goes back to what is it that we are really after. We want to make sure that we get the number of dead right, not necessarily the number of infected, which would be like a bonus, which is an ongoing work that we are doing at the moment. This work is actually being submitted. I unfortunately could not give you, which I initially promised to Kishore, that I will upload it on archives. I couldn't, because certain journals actually do not allow archive upload, and they will not accept after the submission. I mean, certain really top journals, which is what we have gone for. So the point here is the prediction is really good. And now we are going beyond. Our prediction focus will be entirely on mortality, not necessarily on infection. But as you can still see, infection is still very good in terms of prediction. So 0 is 22nd of January, MCMC training I have given you the dates for, and now let's proceed with the other different countries. The color codings are very indicative. The light green refers to the countries which are sort of in the remission mode. So I have chosen representative countries from all these 4 subgroups. My representative country for the ongoing population is UK. For the remission mode is Germany. For the cured group of countries, I have taken Italy for no particular reason. And for the ongoing statistics, ongoing raging bad statistics, I have chosen India, that I will show separately in a different panel. So I'm focusing on groups A, B, C. India is group D. So again, the qualitative description remains exactly the same. You won't see anything out of that qualitative description, which is what most of these models have relied on. Most of the papers that we have come across, me or for that purpose probably you as well, all these numbers have just been rescaled by scaling parameters, which amount to nothing because they're not predictive. In some sense, you can even claim parts of them could be cheating, but I'm not going into that particular very strong claim. It's a suggestion. So Germany comparison, again, bang on. The same structure holds. The left panel is the infected, the right panel is the mortality, that is death. And the outset is always cumulative, the inset is always the daily statistics. So we are literally able to track the statistics day by day and just look at the level of match. Please note, I'm repeatedly and hammering the words match because this is predictive match. The blue patch on either side of the diagrams, either sides of the panels, they are the data training. So they're really, if you like, conventional extrapolation, conventional matching. But based on that AI prediction model that I have been talking about, we have been able to predict the forward days almost accurately. And those forward statistics are represented by the yellow patches. So we go on, we just keep going forward. This is class C, same sort of dynamics, same sort of a structure, same range of training. And now we have Italy for the comparison. Again, you see almost a perfect, well, with Italy, it's an exact and a perfect match. Why so? Because Italian statistics is now completely available. I will show you real numbers later, and that will probably give more credence to my claims. So what is the take-home message from these 3 plots? Well, the take-home message from these 3 panels, of these 3 plots, is our statistics is good, and the prediction is probably even better. So now, at R0, I'm comparing these 3 countries there, UK, Germany, and Italy. R0 I have mentioned, but I will repeat. R0 stands for reproduction number. 3 different definitions of reproduction number and 3 different modes of calculations could be used. I'm not going into those technical details. We have actually sampled and tested for each of those different descriptions, and the results are very converging, so there's nothing to be worried about. In simple understanding terms, what it means is that a reproduction number essentially alludes to the average number of infected people coming out of the first infected person. So how many persons are getting infected by my first person, then the second, and then so on. And R0, anything above 1, typically it's about 1.06 is the given suggestion by WHO. So anything above 1.06 is taken as an epidemic. As you go further higher up, epidemic becomes endemic, and very high up the ladder, it becomes a pandemic. Just look at the numbers for example, UK, Germany, and Italy. So for the first 50 days, 0 to 50, you will clearly see that between 0 to 50, the R0 was almost destructive at 5 approximately. Then it sharply reduced within the first few days, but still it held a saturation value between, I would say, like day number maybe 5 or 6 up to about 50, that plateau region. And after 50, it sort of started falling down progressively, and then eventually it became a lot better. So this is the statistics. It is not a foolproof statistics, but it is an indicative statistics telling you how fast the infection regimen is propagating. Please note there is a difference between the propagation of the infection regime and how the infection itself within the population is spreading. because infection regimen propagating means it's spreading like a wave, and the wave that hits the first locality and goes past it, that has already done the damage. So within that locality, the infection spread takes a completely different independent time statistics that I will show you separately. This is the statistics that I was showing you in the previous slides.